Welcome everybody to United Way of the Greater Triangle second Justice Series event of the year. If you missed the first one, which focused on justice and affordable housing, you can find the recording on our Facebook page, which is at facebook.com/UW Triangle. This is an ongoing conversation series where we explore what justice looks like in practice within United Way's core investment pillars, which are cradle to career, equity and leadership, and healthy families. And specifically how justice-oriented solutions best position communities to create systems-level change. Sorry, letting people in, very distracting. United Way of the Greater Triangle, for those of you who aren't aware, has the bold mission to eradicate poverty and increase social mobility through the power of partnerships. And within that bold mission, we serve a 4-county region of Wake, Durham, Orange, and Johnson counties in North Carolina. We are very aware and very excited about the fact that we've got folks from around the country and around the world who have joined us. And we're honored to be able to have this conversation with people both within our direct area and without, because this is a topic that affects so many individuals and so many organizations. For 133 years, United Ways across the country have served those crushed under the weight of impoverished environments. That service has looked, felt, and sounded like what we consider to be charity, yet the issues have not gone away, and they've actually gotten worse and that's especially true for Black and Brown communities. So our United Way really believes firmly that the next 133 years demand more, and United Way, the Greater Triangle, is up to the challenge to act. Amongst those things, we believe in an orientation to justice, where we look for solutions that attack the root causes and don't just deal with the effects of poverty. And equitable grant making is a necessary and, dare we say, moral step to getting there. So before I introduce our panelists today, I want to explain a little bit more about equitable grant making for people who might not be as familiar with the idea, with the topic, with the strategy. And so we can kind of all level set before starting this conversation. So we're just going to call it out here that grant makers inherently operate from a position of privilege and power. And what we mean by that is that they're responsible for giving money to the people and organizations that need it most. And if grant makers are not conscious of the systemic barriers faced by marginalized or disenfranchised communities, they risk unconsciously perpetuating the very structures and systems they are trying to address. So if we're not intentional, we can unintentionally make improper decisions that don't lead to the solutions that we're ultimately trying to solve for. So equitable grant making is about being conscious of the barriers faced by disadvantaged groups, barriers like race, gender identity, religion, sexual orientation, disability, and many more, and incorporating practices to counterbalance that. And it's then through a justice-focused approach that funders can intentionally try to correct the historical injustices we've seen occur as a result of inequitable grant making, where organizations led by and serving people of color have been traditionally excluded or overlooked by power structures and funding cycles. So doing that not only helps to build the capacity that leaders and their nonprofits need to overcome every hurdle, but it also gives them the power to influence the way that philanthropy serves them and to create the environment that is going to lead to their growth and the achievement of their goals and dreams for this community. So big question here is, what does that actually look like in action? Because it sounds great, right? And that's exactly what our panelists, who are the experts here, are here to talk about and share with you all. So I am very excited, finally, to introduce our panelists today. These are two representatives from the Triangle Capacity Building Network. Tanaya Suddreth Lynch is the program officer at Triangle Community Foundation, whose mission is to help build a more vibrant community for everyone. It's through their strategic investments that they're aiming to fill in gaps, reduce inequities, and solve the region's most pressing challenges. Gladys Hairston is the Director of Learning, Research, and Evaluation at John Rex Endowment. John Rex Endowment's mission is to support an environment where all children and families in Greater Wake County live healthy lives. They're guided by the belief that all children should reach their full potential, and the John Rex Endowment works with the community to support the physical, mental, and emotional well-being of children. So I just threw a lot at you. So I'm going to let Gladys and Tanaya speak for a second. But now I realize I just introduced two organizations that are not actually called the Triangle Capacity Building Network. So before we go any further, Gladys and Tanaya, can either or both of you explain what the Triangle Capacity Building Network is, what your ultimate goal is, and why this should matter to both nonprofit organizations and donors?
Sure, I'm happy to answer that question. Hello, everybody, and thank you for being here for this conversation today. So the Triangle Capacity Building Network was born essentially in 2014. So at that time, there was a local nonprofit organization who had experienced some financial challenges, and ultimately it closed. And so there was a group of funders who were concerned about that issue, and so they began collaborating on how they could better support the region's nonprofit sector as a whole. And from 2014 to now, so this group of funders is made up of Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina Foundation, John Rex Endowment, Oak Foundation, the Mary Duke Biddle Foundation, and Triangle Community Foundation. And so since that time, we've worked together, we've commissioned research, engaged nonprofits in conversations about capacity building, systems, and needs, and begin using what we learned from all of that to work differently in the region. And so some of the things we learned from all of that research that we've done is that capacity building is often overlooked when nonprofit organizations are funded. Donors and foundations typically want to fund projects that have tangible results. You know, how many kids were served, how many beds were provided, and things like that. But misses the opportunity to focus on the vital strategic work that supports the organization over time. And so we also learned that connection allows funders to make greater impact in the work. So we want to transform the way we think about partnership and investment to create stronger triangle nonprofit, a stronger nonprofit triangle region that will be beneficial to everyone. And ultimately, what we learned that nonprofit leadership is predominantly white-led, and that isn't reflective of our region at all because of things like institutional racism, bias, structural barriers. We miss out on the indispensable talent and skills and perspectives of people of color who are just like not represented in this crucial sector. And so this is detrimental to the entire region, and particularly people of color who have been traditionally excluded.
Thank you for that. That was really helpful. And actually, something you said, talking about organizations that are white-led and how it not being representative of our region, actually leads me to the survey that we sent out earlier this week. I'm going to go ahead and screen share this for you all. There we go. So earlier this week, we sent an email out to the folks who had registered as of Monday, I believe it was. So if you didn't receive it, don't panic. It's fine. It was just for extra credit. We reached out to all of you and we asked you to guess the disparity between the revenues of Black-led organizations versus their white-led counterparts. So this is how you guys guessed here. So of the folks that responded, 4% of you think that the revenues of Black-led organizations are 15% smaller than the revenues of their white-led counterparts. And this is more of a national look, not a regional look, just to be clear. 32% of you think that the revenues are 24% smaller. 24% of you think they're 26% smaller, and 40% of you think the revenues are 31% smaller than their white-led counterparts. So I guess there's good news for the majority of the respondents here, the 40% of you who thought, of the respondents that thought that the revenues were 31% smaller than their white-led counterparts. And it's that recent research by Bridgespan looked at the most promising early stage nonprofit organizations that were applying for funding from Echoing Green, which is a social innovation accelerator, and found that on average, the revenues of Black-led organizations are 24% smaller than the revenue of their white-led organizations. And to be clear, they were specifically looking at the applications from organizations that they consider the best of the applicant pool. So this wasn't like, you know, they were comparing apples to apples when it came to like the effectiveness, the mission, the goals of the organization, with the difference being the race of the leader itself. And so for anyone who is interested, we will be sharing that report in the email you'll receive after the event this evening. But we thought it was a really interesting highlight to what it is we're talking about today and why this is so important. and why there are disparities. So I'll stop screen sharing again, and we'll get into the questions. So this question is for either Tanaya or Gladys or both of you. What are the equity disparities we're seeing most in Triangle nonprofits today? Because it's not a factor of needing to show visual representation of equity. It's a lot more than that. You know, what's the real heart of why equity in nonprofit leadership matters?
Yeah, I'll start. First, thank you, United Way, for having me and Tanaya on this panel. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. A lot of people here, a lot more than I thought. So this is a great topic. But to answer your question, Devin, the equity disparities we're seeing today in the Triangle, it could be viewed from two sides of the coin. On the foundation side, I'll talk about that. What we see with inequitable funding is that as funders, we don't always know where or how to find organizations that are doing the work, or just not taking the time to do so because it may take time. But that ends up resulting in funding organizations that we've always funded. Not to say that there's anything wrong with those partners that we have always funded, but funding the same organizations, it closes some people out. And so that leads to inequity stacking on top of inequity. And I think other practices in the way that we fund, the way we receive applications or proposals for funding, those are some other things that have inequities baked into them, just our processes on the foundation side. Having a sole emphasis on written applications that come into us will take, it gives an advantage to larger organizations that have previously been well-funded and well-resourced, that may have dedicated grant writing staff. And so some of those smaller organizations that, have maybe not had as much access to the resources they need to have dedicated staff to think about an application, you have one or two people who are doing a million other things and then trying to carve out additional time to write an application, which we know can take away from the actual mission of organizations. So those are some things that on the philanthropy side that we are working to change and to figure out how to make those processes more accessible, as well as more a varied approach of how we receive information from organizations about what they would like to do and the funding that they need to do it.
And I guess to add on that from the nonprofit side of things, so some of the things that we hear from nonprofits is that, some of the challenges that they face is lack of access to donors and funders and not being invited to be in the room for these types of conversations. So, traditionally people of color don't have access to networks of wealth. Unfortunately, the truth of the matter is that like white people have had centuries to build wealth and have those resources, and typically white people convene and merge in those same networks. And so they have those resources and the networks and the people to support their organizations and have those financial resources, but people of color don't have those same networks. And so in addition to not having the networks, they're just not hearing about the funding opportunities out there. And donors and funders, whenever an organization, for instance, if an organization is led by a white person and then a new person of color comes in, it is the ED of the organization. Typically, the donors and funders who have supported the organization under the white leader also leads with that former ED. And so now this new person of color is having to do all this legwork again and find these supporters and just basically start all over. And that's challenging. And they're having to prove themselves, but yet it's still the same organization doing the same great work.
Right. Wow. That's a lot. That's a lot to think about for, both for the leaders and for the donors to understand like where their actions might be coming from, whether intentional or not, and you guys touched on something that we think about a lot in terms of how we talk about opportunities for funding that we make available or programs that we have at United Way. And it's that, so often, for some reason, leaders of color who might not have had access to opportunities previously can unintentionally be talked about as if they don't have the same qualities as their white, their white counterparts. And so being very intentional about the fact that, like, no, we're not opening up this opportunity because they need help. It's because these doors haven't been open previously. And we want to make sure, because they have these skills, that they have access to these tools that they deserve. And trying to literally create space for everybody at the table in order to really get to that, a more equitable standpoint. So, I applaud you guys for your focus on that. I know we talked at the beginning of this conversation about, marginalized communities can look like anything, like people defined by race, by gender identity, by, disability status. Why did the Triangle Capacity Building Network choose to focus exclusively on opportunities for organizations led by people of color?
Yeah. So when Tanaya introduced the Triangle Capacity Building Network, one of the first activities that we did was to commission some research by the Institute for Nonprofits at NC State University. And their research showed us it was Triangle specific, and Triangle was defined by the funding areas that we all funded in. Let me just take a peek right here, just so I can give you the specifics, because some people consider Triangle. It was Chatham County, Durham, Johnston, Orange, and Wake. And so their research showed that not only are most organizations in the Triangle led by white people, there's 59% are led by women, and 85% are led by someone who identifies as white, and that's the CEO. But then also the board chairs, there was a huge disparity between 79% of board chairs being identifying as white, and then 13% identifying as Black. And so we know that there's a leadership disparity of who's at the helm of organizations, and in the Triangle, and when you couple that with, well, first of all, those numbers have been kind of stagnant for the past 30 years. So our research was in 2017, but unless something has really happened in the past like 3 or 4 years to completely change that, it's probably about the same now, because the numbers were consistent. But when you couple those numbers with the fact that we look at our own foundations and what we have funded, and we see a disparity in where our dollars are going, and then other research that shows that there are fewer dollars going to leaders of color in the nonprofit sector, then it made perfect sense for us to use this as our initial focus of where we wanted to provide capacity building support. And what we have seen and heard from our some of our own grantee partners are the challenges that they've had, like Tanaya alluded to, where as a leader of color who has come into an organization that was previously led by someone who was white, and then just losing funding because those are often tied to relationships. It just made sense for us to start there. And Tanaya, did you want to talk a little bit about like other research since then? Because I focused on the Triangle specifically.
Yeah, I mean, sure. And there's tons of research nationally done on this. The information that Devin shared as a part of the extra credit work, the information from Echoing Green and Bridgespan, and that was done in 2019. And additionally, the Building Movement Project did a survey. They did one in 2016, and then they did a kind of a follow-up survey in 2019. It's the Race to Lead survey. And some of the data from that kind of reinforces the things that our survey demonstrated. Black and white, in terms of inadequate salaries, 47% of people of color feel like they have an inadequate salary versus 38% for white people. As far as opportunities for advancement, 42% of people of color feel like there are few opportunities for advancement compared to that of 31% of white people. Lack of role models, 42% of people of color feel like there's a lack of role models in the nonprofit sector compared to 23% for white people. Lack of relationship with funding sources. There's 35% of people of color feel like there's a lack of funding sources compared to 25% for white people. And I mean, the list goes on and on. So there's plenty of data, to go along with the anecdotal conversations that we had with grantees and our own personal experience in the nonprofit sector that demonstrates the need here. So that's what brought us to this decision to support people of color.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's not just a feeling that you guys are making decisions based on, it's a fact. And the one thing that this made me, not the one thing, but this made me think about the fact, for other foundations that are on this call, I would encourage all of you to really take a look at your own internal practices, because you might, it's easy to institute policies and to have a mindset and to think, okay, we're doing great, but then to take a look at the data and think, oh wait, we're not doing things as intentionally as we wanted to. And United Way actually went through this process a couple of years ago where we took a look at our funding portfolio and we realized that 80% of the nonprofit organizations that we fund supported people of color, yet I believe it's 20%, Nick, chime in here if I'm getting this wrong, but 20% were actually led by people of color. And then more so than that, that the nonprofits that we funded led by men had 3 times the assets of those led by women. And so we actually instituted a program called 10 to Watch in 2018 that was an intentional correction to that invested in 10 local nonprofit leaders of color who are Black, Latinx, and or women who lead nonprofits with annual operating budgets under $1 million to intentionally create the space in order to intentionally make those connections, offer the funding opportunities, and really prepare the broader community for these individuals' long-term success. Not that they didn't already have long-term success previously, but to the point that you all are making, Tanaya and Gladys, that we need to also get the donors ready to be fully on board and to back these leaders. We've seen a lot of success in that. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of the funding opportunities that are currently available at the end of this call, but just keep that in mind. I thought, that was an interesting connection there. So to add to our previous question, why are the actual capacity building and organizational strengthening efforts so key here?
Yeah. And tonight, did you want me to start? Because I don't I keep going first, but I'm happy to do so right now if it's all right. Okay, yeah. Well, Devin, you touched on this earlier when you mentioned that it's not that we're investing in leaders of color because leaders of color have fewer skills or something like that. People could assume that. But capacity building is important for all nonprofits, even for foundations. Our foundation, the John Rex Endowment, have gone through a couple of organizational assessments, looking at our staffing structure, looking at our grant making practices, what's going well, bringing in outside help to outside eyes to look at, here's what we've been doing. Is this the right thing to do? We are going through racial equity capacity building as a board and staff. So capacity building is important for everyone, not just Black and brown leaders. So I want to just say that. I'm preaching to the choir, I know, because you all signed up for this session. You already know that. But I do want to just emphasize that the flaw, if there is a flaw, has been mostly on the part of funders not getting the dollars equitably to nonprofits led by organizations or led by people of color, and not the flaw in those people or organizations themselves. So to back up, when we say capacity building, I mentioned, organizational assessments and even specific topics around racial equity, but it's really capacity building is making sure you have the tools and resources and plans and processes in place to execute your mission well. And that's important for everyone, for every organization that has a mission to do good things for people. It's important. I think it's also important to note that there's some burgeoning research in capacity building that says that not all of the areas of capacity are necessary for one organization to have at the highest level at the same time. And that's something that we're working on too, as in the philanthropic community, is to understand that, okay, maybe someone doesn't have all this back office stuff, like they don't have their own HR staff, their own, financial staff and all of this stuff, but do they have access to it? A lot of that back office capacities for really small organizations, it's hard to do that and to also serve the people that they're trying to serve and eliminate the issues that they're trying to eliminate. So there's capacity building, like the fundamental things that make an organization strong. But then it's also, I think, important to note that not every organization has to have an A+ in everything, but do they have access to the resources that can help them with those areas that they may be lacking in?
Perfect. I was waiting to see if Tanaya had anything else she wanted to say before I chimed in. That was really helpful. And speaking of areas that organizations might want to be better in, but might be lacking in, from a capacity standpoint right now, we know that for the past year, and plus obviously, our entire nation has been embroiled in a very real, very important conversation about anti-racism and systemic racism, and creating the changes that we need on a national level in order to become an equitable country. And so obviously that starts on a regional level. One thing that United Way is doing and has available right now for any organizations locally that feel like they might, this might be a good fit for them, is offering capacity building grants that specifically focus on helping local nonprofits improve their organizational practices, policies, and culture to ensure that they're not perpetuating systemic racism. Again, much like equitable grant making, by not paying attention to some of your practices, policies, and procedures, you can unintentionally perpetuate something that you never intended to do in the first place. And so, I love seeing just the focus that different organizations locally have, both from capacity building from like a very broad point of the funnel, even going down to being as specific as capacity building for anti-racism. There's really so much opportunity to provide that kind of support to nonprofits so that the nonprofits can be the best they could possibly be to support the people who need it most. And so like continuing to, from a foundational or a grant making standpoint, continuing to push our community down the road where it needs to go. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. So you all talked about, obviously from a grant making standpoint, the money for grants has to come from somewhere. Whether, it's a family foundation or whether it's an individual donor situation. How can the average donor support this ultimate goal of creating equity in the nonprofit space locally? And what would be the ideal way for somebody to vet a nonprofit from that lens before donating?
Want to go first, Gladys?
Yes.
So a couple of things that donors and funders could consider is the idea of participatory grant making. So the Triangle Capacity Building Network right now has a grant opportunity open that closes today at midnight. And for this particular round of funding, we lean on the knowledge and expertise of an advisory committee. And the advisory committee was made up of some of our former grantees, as well as some capacity building intermediaries, such as the United Way, and as well as some community members who are just on the ground and familiar and knowledgeable about what the needs are in the Triangle community. And so we, in partnership with this advisory committee, developed the grant making strategy for this grant application based on what they're seeing, what they're hearing, what they're experiencing. because we as funders, we're not on the ground. We are not in the community the way that they are. And so we can't, you know, we can offer up these services, but if it's not what they need, then it doesn't matter. So, you know, one of the things that we're encouraging for donors and funders is to, as they are doing grant making, incorporate the views and perspectives of the communities and those in need of those services into their grant making strategy. Additionally, one thing that we are learning more about is the concept of full cost funding. And I will say, Gladys, I lean to her because I feel like she's our in-house expert on full cost funding. But essentially, it's the idea of whenever you're making grants for organization, again, it's more, don't just think about the programmatic work. Don't just think about those bowls of food and the blankets for babies and whatever, homes for dogs. Like, think beyond that. Like, what does it take to do that? The people power, to whatever, fix the food, deliver the food, whatever it is, like, you know, whatever goes into that work, you need to be funding that because they can't do the work without the people in those places. And so I don't know, Gladys, you want to talk more about that concept?
Mhm. Yeah, so I mean, full cost funding is really important. It is, you know, making sure that everything is not doesn't necessarily have to be tied to a program or project. Don't get us wrong, like babies' beds are really like that's important. No one's gonna argue against that. And coats and food, those are like on the hierarchy of needs, those are fundamental things that everyone needs, and God bless people who are providing those services. But sometimes as funders, there are other organizations who often feel left out of that or feel like they have to adjust their missions to do that too, in addition to some of the other things that are needed. So full cost funding is where funding opportunities are flexible so organizations can access other dollars related to like their cash reserves, related to the planning that they may need. And I won't go into like full detail about all the pieces of that pie, but it's another thing that funders can look at if we want to fund organizations to be able to execute their missions well, is just to look at, so where are the pieces of their operations that could use some support, so they don't have to worry about, you know, both serving the people that they're serving as well as, you know, keeping their doors open themselves. I think another piece of your question, or Tanaya, did you want to add anything else before I
No.
say something? Okay, yeah, another piece of your question, Devin, is what can donors or funders do? I mean, to start setting aside funds that are specifically for organizations led by people of color is helpful. It's important to do this intentionally because we know that in instances of racial equity, inequities have occurred in our country, in our world, intentionally. So we have to be intentional about disrupting. So setting aside funds that are accessible to people led, organizations led by people of color is important. We still don't do this as equitably as we could because those are often smaller pots of funding than our general dollars. And one of our grantees reminded me recently, this was an African-American ED, reminded me that, you know, the ultimate goal is to have access to the regular pots of funding, you know, in an equitable way. So, and that is where we are striving to. It's not that we always want to have funding that is set aside in this way, but until we figure out how to do this right, then that's the way to do it, because the color blindness has not worked so far, and it's not going to work where we are right now. I think does that answer fully your question, Devin?
It does, absolutely. And I appreciate that. And you make a very good point about leaders of color, you know, the full culmination of equitable grant making being the equal access to the you know, the general pots and not like these specialized funds. And I thought that was a really interesting point to make. And this is a little bit of an aside, but a story that I like to tell that I read years ago. I believe it was the New York Symphony years ago started hosting, they did a test where they started hosting blind auditions. and they were judging potential applicants for the symphony based only on the quality of the music they could produce. And what they found through this test, and I don't know if they still do this or not, I hope they do, but that they started making more offers to musicians of color and female musicians than they were previously by an astounding rate. And I apologize that I don't remember the exact data points at this time, but it's like, it's just something to consider, where it's how do we get creative with, perhaps removing these barriers, adding additional opportunities, how do we think outside the box? And that always sticks with me when I think about getting creative. So we've talked a lot already, and we're gonna have Q&A in a few minutes. We've talked a lot about what aren't we doing? What do we need to do? And I want to end on a really positive note. And I was hoping either or both of you could tell us a story about how this conscious shift in the way that you're making funding decisions has positively benefited a local nonprofit or a local neighborhood or individual leader.
Gladys, I'll let you go ahead and take us home.
Oh, okay. Well, I didn't know if this question was specific about the TCBN, because Tanaya is more familiar with those grantees as the program officer, but I can give a different quick example.
Yeah, please, any story you have.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to go back and acknowledge that there aren't that many people of color working in philanthropy either. And so, for foundations to do this really well, one of my colleagues reminded me, Sabrina, she's on the call today. She said, it's important for foundations to lean on the lived experience of their staff of color. And I think that I've seen that take place in, last year what year is it? It's like 2020 didn't happen because of COVID, but it's like a gap there. But it was year before last, 2019, we had funded some organizations that were led by people of color. And one of the women that we funded, she said she'd been trying to get in the door of this funder. And it didn't matter how many times she talked to them and the information she gave them, they just weren't ready to invest in her organization. And then after we gave her, I didn't know this story, but we gave her a grant, her organization a grant. And she told us that after that funder who wouldn't invest in her called her and said, I think we could work something out. And it kind of made me annoyed, but I was happy for her at the same time. But I was like, she's the same person. This is the same group that she was the day before the John Rex Endowment approved funding her organization. But I mean, I think I get it. As foundations, sometimes we don't want to be early adopters. We have more latitude to take risk than we often do. But I think that was a positive experience for her because she was excited about it. She said that it gave her in this organization, this funder's eyes, like, a little bit more of what they viewed as validation. I don't want to use that word, but it was just interesting. And I was really excited about that opportunity for her. I wish it didn't necessarily have to come with like, oh, well, someone else has co-signed for you, you must be a good person kind of thing. But it did. And we got to take the wins where we can right now. So that's one positive story I have.
And I think, Gladys, I think that's a common thing too, just thinking about some of the things that we've heard from our TCBN grantees is that once, we invested in them, it created opportunity for other funders to invest in them. And as a community foundation, we also have individual donors who are looking to invest in organizations. And so I think because of our participation in the Triangle Capacity Building Network and our experience with these more diverse funders, we're able to offer these phenomenal organizations led by people of color to our individual donors so that they can begin investing in these organizations. So again, creating opportunity, creating access to networks, creating, just more resources, more financial resources, and opening doors for some of our grantees. So I would say that that's a theme all the way around.
That's fantastic. Will Jackson in the comments also shared something that I thought was interesting, and that maybe people don't realize or do realize as it's happening, but that folks are more likely to take risks with white funders. You know, there's a level of comfort there that doesn't necessarily exist, and, you know, encouraging donors and foundations to recognize where their instincts or decision making might be coming from, and to really like take a look at, well, why am I making this decision? And, you know, if I'm calling this person back, sorry, he meant founders, but I think I understood what he meant, and then I read it, and then I'm answering the way he intended. You know, but really thinking through, like, if I'm going to call them back, am I calling them back because I've made a decision, because I've decided that they're worth it when I didn't think they were previously because of my initial perception based on the color of their skin? You know, we really need to be intentional and honest with ourselves about the decisions that we're making and our unintentional biases that might come with it. It's important to have these conversations and to lean into them. Before we get to the Q&A portion, hey, Gladys and Tanaya, I just want to thank you guys so much. And I want to thank everybody for being here. This is not an easy conversation. It's not an easy process by any means. And I want to thank you guys for the intentionality that you bring to making these decisions. I also want to share really quickly for anybody who doesn't know, I did drop the Triangle Capacity Building Network, the grant that they have, the grant application that they have open available through midnight. I dropped the link in the chat for anybody who wants to grab it. Additionally, United Way has its RFP available until March 1st. So I'll drop those links in too, but if you go to unitedwaytriangle.org/RFP, you can see the grants that we have available through our Cradle to Career and Healthy Family pillars of investment pillars, as well as the what we're calling the ARC-Accelerator grant opportunity, which is short for Anti-Racism Community Fund Accelerator, as well as the Anti-Racist Capacity Building Grant and the 10 to Watch opportunities. So please, please, please take a look at all of that, apply. We have a community-driven process that ensures that every application goes through community readers who are volunteering from everywhere, from you know, local corporations to individual volunteers. It then, you know, goes through different committees and through a board of directors who are all volunteers. And so we want to ensure that this is as equitable and as community driven as possible. If anybody is interested in volunteering to be a reader, it's entirely virtual, and I will drop that link into the chat as well.
Real quick, before we go to Q&A, I just wanted to say too, for the TCBN application, don't be intimidated by the fact that it is due tonight at midnight. We have streamlined the application, and so it's really doable by midnight if you meet the eligibility requirements and feel like it's something you want to do. So don't let that be a barrier.
Thank you for that. So with that being said, who has questions? Feel free to drop them in the chat or unmute yourself and speak up. We are here until 1, and we are happy to take any questions anybody might have. And actually, we have one already. So Ari's going to kick us off. In 2020, funding racial equity became more widely popular due to the huge response to the murder of George Floyd. What is happening to ensure that funders are serious about supporting Black-led organizations for the long haul rather than just doing it as part of the trend?
Well, I can say even I have had that same like fear or concern. I think I've expressed that in our foundation, like, is the other shoe going to drop? I think part of that is just like the skepticism that we've seen, you know, things ebb and flow in the past. The Association for Black Foundation Executives, I wish I had this up. They are called ABFE, but they had a call to action recently. I think it was in part by what happened to George Floyd, to call funders to sign on and you know, agree that this is not going to be one of those moments where we you know, we follow the shiny light like a little cat chasing a laser pointer, and then we forget about it. But to make sure that this is something that we are championing, I think that ways that individual foundations can do that is, I think some of us, our foundation included, John Rex Endowment, other foundations as well, is going through racial equity work ourselves. Like the amount that foundations, funders need to go through education and learning about these things, it can't be understated, because then it can help embed the language and the practices in our organizations. A lot of times we're so busy funding things that will build other people's capacity. We have to build our own capacity in this way. So it isn't something that just kind of goes away. I would love to say, oh yeah, I could see a difference this time, and it's going to absolutely be a transformational change from henceforth, now and forever. But I guess no one really has that mirror ball, but just to keep at it, and to acknowledge that we have had instances where things have gone, 2 steps forward, 4 steps back before.
I don't have anything to add to that. Yeah.
That was great. Yeah, agreed. It needs to be a permanent solution, and it needs to be a conscious, permanent, strategic shift for these grant makers. Will wants to know, he says, I'm curious what percentage of their total funders on the phone are looking to commit to Black and Brown-led organizations leading with a racial equity approach. What percentage do you think would be equitable? 50%, 75%, 95%?
So I think that is a very valid question. And I think that funders, those are the types of conversations that funders need to be happening. Again, like Gladys said, like not just in this moment, but beyond, now that like this great awakening has happened, like it's not just for this moment. And so I know that, those are conversations that we at TCF are having. We haven't, dedicated a specific amount or a percentage of our funding towards supporting people of color, but we know that supporting people of color organizations is a value of ours across our impact areas. So like for me personally with capacity building, I mean, I can say for my program area, for sure, over 50% of my budget is dedicated to supporting people of color led organizations. And I know that, our other impact areas, that is a value of theirs, and they are prioritizing that as well. But I can't say for a specific percentage, but I know that we are having conversations about what that could look like as a strategic priority for the foundation as a whole. So thank you for that question, William, and just know that we're having that conversation, and I hope the other funders on the call are having that conversation within their organizations as well. I don't know what you're doing, Gladys. But.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I appreciate this conversation too. Our foundation, we had a book club where we were reading Decolonizing Wealth, that talks about, amongst many things, but the history of how these dollars were accumulated in our foundations. And it's by Edgar Villanueva. One of the things that he mentioned was, what if foundations set aside at least a tithe of their dollars for, Black and Indigenous people? And so I started doing the math when I was reading the book. I would love to say a percentage on behalf of the John Rex Endowment. I cannot do that. But when I was doing the math, I came up with like some numbers, for what that tithe looks like, and just setting it aside in our grant budget. I would love, as Gladys Hairston, not as the John Rex Endowment, this is what we're going to do. I don't want anyone to confuse that, but I would love for that to be a start of our grant budget. And then, I mean, when you think about this is where like equity, it could get very tricky, because when you think about the roots of where our dollars came from, what is equitable? What's the definition of equitable for dollars that were accumulated a couple centuries ago on the backs of Black and Brown people? I mean, equitable may be 100%, but I don't know what that number would look like. But I think that was a great concept that Edgar posed for foundations to start to do, because a tithe would be a lot more than a lot of us are giving right now. And I think it's a great start. It may not be the end of it though.
Thank you for that. So I recognize we only have 6 minutes left and we've gotten 2 really good questions. So I'm going to commit to asking these 2 questions that we have so far. And then if anybody has follow-up questions or wants to learn more about our 2 panelists today, Triangle Community Foundation's website is trianglecf.org, and John Rex Endowment is johnrexendowment.org. So please do feel free to check out their websites, reach out with any questions, continue the conversation, and also take a look at the grant opportunities they have as they become available. Joey Current, who I hear through the grapevine also has a birthday today, asked many United Ways use a rubric, happy birthday, Joey, scored by community readers in their selection process for grants. And he wants to know, can you discuss how a funder might improve their rubrics and or their grading process to make more equitable funding decisions?
So I'll speak about our particular funding opportunity right now. So we do use a rubric to make these funding decisions. And so as I mentioned with participatory grant making, we, again, look to our advisory committee and ask them like, what do you feel like is the most important thing to look for in this application? Like we are not, looking at with people of color, you look at like things like grammar and things like that, as a part of like that white supremacy culture document. I'm blanking on her name right now who wrote that, but the value of the written word is so important, and like that's not a priority for our advisory committee. It's like, how do you describe the need and impact of what your organization, what do you need, and what is the impact that your organization is going to be able to make if you get these dollars? And like that's what's most important for our advisory committee, as well as like how are organizations incorporating the experience of those with lived experiences into their decision making, because again, you can't really, how can you do this work and try to achieve outcomes without knowing what those you serve really need? So our rubric is based on the experience of our advisory committee, who again are nonprofit leaders, who are community members, who doing work embedded in the community. And so that's one thing that we're doing right now. But we also understand that a rubric is not necessarily the best tool for evaluating applications, but I think it's a process. Again, acknowledging that, submitting an application, like written application, might not be the best move either, but we just got to take it one step at a time and try to get better as we continue to learn and grow and go through this. So.
Awesome, thank you for that. So Nicole's question, Nicole Morgan here said that given that what we are really talking about here is changing the mindsets of individuals, both donors and founders, who make decisions with their own biases, values, and beliefs, how long do we truly think that shift towards equitable funding practices will take place here in the Triangle and in North Carolina? Changing and or influencing mindsets deeply ingrained takes massive change, a willingness and time, but worry about how much time people of color-led organizations really have to wait for this change, as their sustainability is heavily weighed on philanthropic practices and policies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the middle part of the question is like, how long do we think this will take to truly shift? I wish I had an answer, Nicole, because sometimes I'll get on conversations and it depends on who I'm talking to on these calls, and it's like, oh yeah, we're making great strides. And then quite honestly, I'll get on another call with another funder, and we'll hear some of that same language pop up, and like, oh, well, maybe there's more information that we need to give this funder because I don't know that everybody is at the same place of even acknowledging the challenge in inequitable funding, or now acknowledging the power imbalance. I don't even necessarily like using the word power, but that imbalance that occurs. That's one major piece. Sometimes we're in rooms where we are talking to those where we're like, oh yeah, this is going to be a quick shift because we are in our, vacuum or in a good way, but then hearing other funders and it's like, oh, there's a lot of work to be done. I know I didn't really give you a time period because the frustrating part of that is like for nonprofits that are facing these barriers now, they have to just sit and wait for funders to get our act together, or even for funders who are ready to make these shifts now, we have to wait for, partnership and other funders to come along, and just figuring out what that messaging is. Like, different people need to hear this message in different ways. It's tough. But I think what we can do right now is, like I said earlier, like celebrate those wins and figure out how, in some ways, we don't necessarily want to leave people behind, but we don't want them to hold us back in what we know needs to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. So I want to be conscious of everybody's time. We are at 1 o'clock. So we're going to have to cap the conversation, although I know this could continue forever. We've had so many good questions. We've had so many good points come out of this. I really loved hearing just how intentional and focused you, Tanaya and Gladys, are towards these efforts. And I just encourage everybody to keep thinking about it, to keep asking questions, to keep talking, to keep pushing, to get in touch if you have more questions, if you want to understand better. We can be resources for each other throughout this process for as long as it needs to continue. The next Justice Series conversation is going to focus on justice in Johnston County, which, for those who aren't familiar with the Triangle region, is a more rural community, has a very different residential audience than, say, Orange County or Wake County. So that'll happen March 26th. We'll send out the invite for that once it's available. But for now, thank you guys so much. We'll have the recording available on Facebook and YouTube shortly. So I hope everybody has a great weekend.